William Henry Harrison was like a flash of light in the American political sky, short, brilliant, and left more clues than answers. When mentioning the ninth president, people often remember his long term of exactly 31 days. But behind that number is a lifetime of wandering between the wild frontier, the battlefield, the political arena, and the expectations that America had in store for him in the early 19th century. His journey from a young man who dropped out of medicine to become a symbol of the frontier spirit makes this story both dusty and smelling of gunpowder, mixed with the tragic comedy of a turbulent era. When looking back at his life, people see not only a historical figure, but also the context of America growing up, dividing, and trying to find its own identity. Those pieces create a small story, but with lasting resonance. Chapter 1: A Frontier Childhood. William Henry Harrison entered the world in 1773 in a brick mansion overlooking the James River in Virginia. The house, Berkeley Plantation, carried the scent of tobacco fields, damp timber, and horse sweat, the unmistakable perfume of colonial aristocracy. Yet the boy born into that comfort would grow into a man defined not by polished always, but by muddy frontiers, dangerous woods, and the crack of muskets. His story was destined to stretch far beyond the limits of his family's wealth. His father, Benjamin Harrison V., was one of the men who signed the Declaration of Independence. This meant the boy grew up in a household that treated rebellion not as a distant echo, but as a nightly dinner table subject. William's earliest memories were less of toys than of revolutionary whispers, candlelit arguments about liberty, strangers riding up with urgent messages, the occasional loud thud of boots as soldiers arrived seeking guidance. For a child, it was a world half thrilling, half terrifying, like watching adults perform a dangerous ritual whose rules he didn't yet understand. He ran through the fields with the carefree recklessness of any young boy, though always with that sense that larger forces were shaping the land around him. Sometimes he overheard farmhands speaking in hushed tones about British patrols or American victories. Sometimes he saw his father staring long into the river at dusk, hands clasped tightly behind his back, a posture that told a story heavier than any words. William was the youngest of several children, and his siblings treated him with that mixture of affection and mockery reserved for the last hatchling of a large family. He responded by becoming quick, stubborn, and endlessly curious. He studied Latin with uneven enthusiasm, preferring to slip outside where the wind carried stories the textbooks never told. Servants taught him bits of African lore, farmers shared superstitions about river spirits, and his own wandering brought him close to the culture of local native tribes long before politics thrust him into their world. His mother was gentle but firm, raising him with a blend of Anglican discipline and frontier practicality. She expected him to behave like a gentleman even when he looked like a wild creature with mud up to his knees. Still, she understood something essential about him. William was drawn to the unknown. His eyes lit up not at inheritances or polite futures, but at maps. He could stare at maps for hours, those sprawling, inaccurate sketches of mountains, forests, and rivers stretching endlessly westward. The older he grew, the more the revolution shaped him. He watched Virginia change from a colony to a state, saw soldiers return missing limbs, heard the sobs of widows. These things pressed into him like fingerprints left on clay. They taught him that politics wasn't abstract. It was blood, tears, courage, exhaustion. And it made him crave a life where action meant more than words. Benjamin Harrison V., wanting his son to rise properly in society, pushed him toward medicine. The family enrolled William in a classical education, and then at the age of 17, sent him to study under Dr. Benjamin Rush in Philadelphia, one of the country's most respected physicians. In theory, it was the perfect path. In practice, it was a terrible match. William was fascinated by anatomy, but repulsed by the sight of suffering he could not fix. He enjoyed intellectual debate, but hated the idea of spending his life indoors, surrounded by tools and tinctures, detached from the world's grand sweep. Philadelphia itself, sophisticated, bustling, cultured, felt to him like a cage with fine wallpaper. Then fate intervened in the most brutal way. His father died suddenly, leaving William without financial support. The comfortable future his family had envisioned simply evaporated. In its place stood a crossroads, as stark and dramatic as any on a frontier trail. Military service became the most practical, immediate option. It wasn't just necessity, it was instinct. The Army promised travel, purpose, and danger, all things that called to him more strongly than scalpels or lecture halls. And so, before he had turned 18, he enlisted. In 1791, young Harrison joined the U.S. Army as an ensign, sent west into the thick, humid, mosquito-plagued expanse of the Northwest Territory. The land was raw, contested, beautiful, and deadly, all at once. The frontier didn't care about birthright or family name. It demanded grit. It demanded quick thinking. It demanded respect. For Harrison, it felt like stepping into the world he had always sensed waiting for him. He rode past towering forests that swallowed sunlight, through swamps where horses sunk to their chests, along rivers so wide they seemed to carry entire seasons in their currents. He met native nations whose leaders carried themselves with the same dignity he had seen in the revolutionaries of his childhood. He saw American settlers scraping out fragile lives on the edges of wilderness. He witnessed hunger, fear, bravery, cruelty, and camaraderie in equal measure. He was not simply living history, he was barreling headfirst into it. And thus began the shaping of the man who would one day win a presidential election with songs, parades, and a log cabin legend, but whose soul had been forged long before on muddy paths under a frontier moon. Chapter 2: The Frontier Captain. William Henry Harrison was still barely a young man when the frontier called to him with a voice both wild and promising, like a distant drum echoing across the Ohio Valley. He had grown up among Virginia's stately plantations and political conversations, but the West, raw, restless, untamed, would become the anvil that shaped him. At 19, with more eagerness than certainty, he joined the U.S. Army, stepping into a world where survival depended less on genteel manners and more on steady nerves and the ability to read danger before it arrived. General Mad Anthony Wayne, famous for both brilliance and volatility, became Harrison's commander and unexpected mentor. Under Wayne's demanding eye, Harrison learned that frontier warfare was nothing like the ordered, European-style military manuals suggested. Battles here were shaped by forests dense as fortresses and alliances that shifted like river currents. Native confederacies, determined to defend their homelands, moved silently through the woods. American troops, still inexperienced, struggled to anticipate an enemy who knew the land more intimately than their own heartbeat. Harrison proved himself quickly, not through bravado, but through a calmness that steadied the men around him. In camp, he absorbed every detail: how supply lines faltered in winter, how morale wavered when fear outpaced food, how a commander's voice could either fracture or fortify. On patrol, he watched shadows with the attention of a scholar reading an ancient text. This quiet competence earned him trust long before he officially ranked high enough to demand it. In 1794, at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, Harrison experienced his first true glimpse of war's chaos. Trees splintered under musket fire, smoke clung to the humid air, and orders vanished beneath the thunder of charging horses. Yet he stayed composed, guiding his unit steadily forward. When the native alliance retreated, not defeated in spirit, but overwhelmed by force and circumstance, Harrison understood something that would follow him all his life. Victory in the West was never clean, and peace was never permanent. By the time the Treaty of Greenville reshaped the map of the Northwest Territory, Harrison had found his calling. The frontier, its dangers, its politics, its contradictions had tightened its grip around him. He was still young, yes, but he had already transformed from a sheltered Virginian into a soldier tempered by forests, fear, and an emerging sense of destiny. And somewhere in that vast western horizon, a future governor, general, and ultimately a president was beginning to form. Chapter 3. Governor of a Restless Land. When William Henry Harrison accepted the role of governor of the newly formed Indiana Territory in 1801, he stepped into a political landscape that resembled a tinderbox more than a government. The territory was enormous, stretching across what would one day become Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and parts of Minnesota. It was a land where competing ambitions collided daily. Settlers hungry for land, native nations fighting to preserve their world, and Washington politicians chasing influence from far away. Harrison arrived with the combination of frontier experience and Virginia polish, a blend that made him both approachable and, at times, deeply underestimated. His mission seemed simple on paper: maintain peace, administer justice, and guide the territory toward statehood. In reality, his task was a game of balancing contradictions. Every treaty he negotiated carried the weight of two incompatible truths. Settlers believed expansion was destiny, while native leaders saw each acre ceded as another wound torn from their homeland. He spent long days at the treaty table, leaning forward over parchment maps lit by candles that flickered like nervous hearts. Some treaties came through careful diplomacy, others were pushed forward by pressure from Washington or the desperation of tribes facing dwindling resources. Harrison tried to portray these agreements as mutual pathways to coexistence, but deep down he knew the bargains were uneven and the consequences would be lasting. It was during this period that a new presence began to hunt Harrison's political horizon: Tecumseh, a charismatic Shawnee leader whose eloquence could ignite entire villages. Tecumseh rejected the idea of individual tribes selling land. He saw the land as a collective trust belonging to all native nations. His logic was sharp, his conviction magnetic, and his growing alliance threatened not just treaties, but the legitimacy of the entire territorial government. Harrison recognized in Tecumseh a rare kind of adversary: honorable, intelligent, and fiercely determined. Their meetings crackled with tension, a clash of two visions for the future of the American West. Tecumseh spoke with the gravity of a man defending his people's survival. Harrison responded with the authority of a governor whose mandate was tied to a nation expanding faster than diplomacy could keep up. Meanwhile, settlers flooded the territory in waves. Log cabins multiplied along riverbanks, fields were carved out of forests, and towns sprouted like hardy seedlings. Harrison did his best to impose order, establishing courts, raising militias, and championing infrastructure. But the pace of change often outran his policies. Privately, the frontier governor wrestled with the complexity of his role. He believed in progress, yet he could not fully ignore the displacement it caused. He valued peace, yet he signed treaties that pushed tensions toward war. History often turns men into symbols. But in these years, Harrison was painfully human, learning that leadership on the frontier demanded both decisiveness and a tolerance for moral ambiguity. As Tecumseh's Confederacy grew stronger and pressure mounted from Washington, Harrison sensed that the fragile balance he had tried to maintain was beginning to crack. The next chapter of his life
and of the territory would no longer be shaped at the negotiating table, but on the battlefield. The storm was gathering, and both men could feel the air tightening before the first thunder rolled.
Chapter 4. The Road to Tippecanoe. The fragile peace Harrison had struggled to maintain dissolved slowly, like frost giving way to morning sun. By the early 1810s, tension pulsed through the Indiana Territory. Rumors traveled faster than horses. Whispers of native alliances, of British agents stirring unrest, of Tecumseh moving from village to village with the conviction of a prophet. Something vast was taking shape, and Harrison knew the center of that movement lay in a settlement that was both a sanctuary and a warning: Prophetstown. Prophetstown stood at the confluence of the Wabash and Tippecanoe rivers, and it had become the heartbeat of the Confederacy. While Tecumseh traveled widely to recruit tribes, his brother Tenskwatawa, the prophet, guided the community with spiritual authority. It was a place where people gathered not just to resist land cessions, but to reconnect with a cultural identity after years of erosion. To Harrison, however, the settlement looked like a powder keg waiting for a spark. His correspondence with Washington grew more urgent. He reminded federal officials that Tecumseh's movement was no mere protest, but a coalition with military potential. Many in the capital brushed off his concerns, seeing frontier disputes as local headaches. Harrison understood better. This was the first tremor of a possible earthquake. In the summer of 1811, everything shifted. Tecumseh traveled south to rally the Creek Nation, leaving Prophetstown under Tenskwatawa's leadership. Harrison sensed an opening. With authorization from the Secretary of War, he assembled a force of roughly 1,000 men, regular soldiers, territorial militia, and volunteers. They marched north through the forests glowing with the deep colors of late autumn, the air carrying the restless energy of an impending fight. Harrison was no reckless commander. Each night he ordered careful camps, defensive lines, and scouts. He hoped, perhaps naively, that intimidation might succeed where negotiation had failed. If Prophetstown saw the size of his force, maybe they would disperse without a battle. When Harrison arrived near Tippecanoe Creek, he requested a meeting with the prophet. Tenskwatawa responded with spiritual confidence, insisting that peace was possible. Yet Harrison's instincts pricked at inconsistencies in the prophet's words. The air felt too quiet, as if the land were holding its breath. Just before dawn, on November 11th, 1811, the silence shattered. A force of native warriors launched a sudden assault on Harrison's encampment. They moved through darkness like shadows, slipping between tents and firing with fierce precision. Harrison, roused from sleep, mounted his horse and rode through the lines, shouting commands with steady urgency. He repositioned companies, directed reinforcements, and kept the defensive perimeter from buckling. His calm under chaos steadied the men around him. The battle raged for 2 brutal hours. Flames from gunshots danced across the camp, lighting faces twisted with fear and determination. Warriors struck from multiple angles, testing weak points, but Harrison's men held. As dawn finally broke, the attackers retreated into the forest, leaving behind fallen brothers and an uncertain future. The Americans called it a victory, though it had come at a heavy price. Prophetstown was later burned, its people scattered, but Tecumseh's Confederacy was not extinguished, only wounded. Harrison knew this. He looked over the charred ruins with a mixture of relief and unease, aware that the battle had settled nothing permanently. It had simply moved the conflict to a new stage. The Battle of Tippecanoe transformed Harrison's reputation. Frontier settlers hailed him as a defender of their homes. Newspapers printed his name with newfound respect. His soldiers spoke of his composure as proof of natural leadership. But history is rarely simple. Some saw the battle as a necessary act of protection. Others saw it as the spark that would ignite deeper wars. Tecumseh certainly viewed it as betrayal and the beginning of a reckoning.
For Harrison, the path ahead would lead from the smoldering banks of the Tippecanoe to the broader fires of the War of 1812. And somewhere across rivers and forests, Tecumseh was returning home, carrying with him the fury of a leader who had lost more than a battle. The next clash would be far larger, and neither man could avoid it.
Chapter 5. The Rising Storm of 1812. The smoke of Tippecanoe had barely drifted into memory when the world around William Henry Harrison began to shift in ways that felt both inevitable and unsettling. The fragile balance between the United States and Great Britain, already strained by years of maritime disputes, trade restrictions, and the forced impressment of American sailors, finally tore apart in the summer of 1812. Congress declared war, and the frontier became one of its wildest and most unpredictable battlegrounds. For Harrison, the war was not an abstraction debated in distant capitals. It was a storm that rolled straight toward the Great Lakes and the Western Territories, the place he knew best. And in that storm, he sensed the return of a formidable adversary, Tecumseh. The Battle of Tippecanoe had wounded Tecumseh's Confederacy, but it had not destroyed it. The scattered tribal alliances regrouped, and when war erupted between the United States and Britain, Tecumseh found an opportunity he had long anticipated. The British, with their forts clustered around the Great Lakes, welcomed him and his warriors as powerful allies. Tecumseh's presence reinvigorated the native resistance, turning the frontier into a complex chessboard of loyalties and reprisals. Harrison watched these events unfold with a grim understanding. He had studied Tecumseh's leadership for years. The man was disciplined, charismatic, and unwavering in purpose. Unlike many American officials who dismissed him as merely another tribal leader, Harrison recognized Tecumseh as a strategic thinker with a vision, a united front of native nations defending their homeland. And now, with British support behind him, Tecumseh's Confederacy possessed new momentum. After the shocking surrender of Detroit by General Hull, a capitulation that sent waves of disbelief across the young nation, Harrison was appointed commander of the Northwestern Army. The responsibility was massive. He now bore the burden of reclaiming lost territory, restoring public confidence, and breaking the alliance between Tecumseh and the British. He approached his new command with the meticulous discipline of a man who knew the terrain intimately. He reorganized forces, secured supply lines, and prepared for winter campaigns that would test both endurance and ingenuity. His headquarters became a hive of maps, messengers, and restless soldiers, each waiting for word of what Tecumseh would do next. There was no illusion of an easy victory. Every mile of forest concealed the possibility of ambush. Every fort represented months of struggle. Yet Harrison found in the chaos a strange clarity. The war was bigger than him, bigger than any single general, but he carried a sense of destiny, a belief that the frontier was his battlefield to understand, to defend, and perhaps to reshape. Across the lakes, Tecumseh sharpened his resolve. He fought not for empire, but for survival. Cultural, territorial, spiritual. He saw the war as proof that the United States was vulnerable, that indigenous nations could reclaim lost ground. His partnership with British General Isaac Brock grew into something rare, mutual respect. Tecumseh admired Brock's boldness, and Brock admired Tecumseh's discipline and loyalty. When Brock fell in battle, Tecumseh mourned him deeply, yet his commitment to the war only strengthened. The conflict was no longer just geopolitical, it had become personal. Back in Harrison's encampment, tension simmered. The winter of 1812-1813 carved into the soldiers' morale. Supplies froze in transit, horses died on icy roads. Much of the landscape transformed into swampy hell after sudden thaws. Through it all, Harrison moved among his men with that familiar ease, part soldier, part neighbor, part steadying presence. He listened to their gripes, shared their fires,
and earned their trust with the quiet currency of consistency. In the letters he wrote to Washington, however, his tone sharpened. He warned of a frontier hanging by threads. He urged for reinforcements, better coordination, clearer strategies. This was not a war to be fought from desks. It was a war of rivers, forests, and unpredictable alliances. By early 1813, the stage was set for a decisive change. Harrison's army, though battered by weather and shortages, stood ready for a campaign that would push deep into contested territory. He had no illusions about the difficulty ahead. Tecumseh and his warriors remained confident and agile. British forces still held strategic forts. Settlers lived in constant dread of raids and reprisals. But history often pivots on the stubborn few who refuse to yield. As Harrison tightened his preparations for the coming campaign, he could almost feel Tecumseh doing the same across the water. Two leaders bound by conflict, shaped by the land, and driven by visions that could never coexist, were moving on a collision course. The War of 1812 would not simply test Harrison's command, it would carve his legacy. And waiting in the shadows of those forests and rivers was the man who understood him most clearly. Not an ally, but a rival, whose respect came wrapped in inevitability. The next chapter of their entwined destinies was about to unfold.
Chapter 6: The Road to the Thames. The winter had barely lifted its icy grip from the Northwest Territory when William Henry Harrison sensed that the tide of war was finally beginning to shift. The hardships of 1812 had left deep grooves in the spirit of his army, yet they had also carved out something else: endurance. Harrison understood that victory often belonged not to the strongest force, but to the force that simply refused to collapse. And in early 1813, he was determined to turn endurance into momentum. News arrived from the east like a spark striking dry tinder. American forces had won key naval battles on Lake Erie, thanks in large part to the brilliant young commander Oliver Hazard Perry. His triumphant message, "We have met the enemy and they are ours," traveled the frontier with the speed of hope. For Harrison, Perry's victory was not just a morale boost, it meant something far more tangible. Control of Lake Erie meant supply lines could reopen, reinforcements could move swiftly, and British positions along the lake were now vulnerable. It also meant Tecumseh's alliance with the British faced its first true fracture. For months, Harrison had watched British commanders struggle to maintain their hold on the western forts. Without control of the lake, they could not adequately supply their garrisons. Their soldiers were stretched thin, and Tecumseh, ever the realist behind his passionate exterior, understood the implications. If the British could no longer support the Confederacy, their united front risked unraveling. Still, Tecumseh remained resolute. He saw the war not as a series of setbacks and advances, but as a living struggle for the survival of his people. Even if the British faltered, he could not. The alliance had cost too many lives, demanded too many sacrifices, and held too much of his personal honor to abandon now. He rallied his warriors not with promises of easy triumphs, but with reminders of homeland, heritage, and the long line of ancestors who had walked these forests before them. In September 1813, Perry met with Harrison in a moment that seemed to fuse the energy of two different kinds of commanders, one born of the sea, the other forged on the frontier. Their meeting set in motion a campaign that felt like the beginning of something decisive. Harrison prepared his troops to pursue the British northward into Upper Canada, driving them away from Detroit, away from American soil, and away from the native alliance that strengthened them. What followed was a whirlwind of movement. Harrison's army, invigorated by victory and fresh supplies, marched swiftly up the Detroit River. The British, now under General Henry Proctor, retreated in disarray. But Proctor was no Brock.
He lacked the charisma, daring, and clarity that had made Tecumseh admire Brock as a brother. Proctor hesitated when decisiveness was needed. He delayed when urgency demanded action. And most unforgivably in Tecumseh's eyes, he prioritized his own safety over the fate of the Confederacy. Tecumseh confronted him more than once, his frustration simmering into open contempt. He accused Proctor of cowardice, of betraying their shared strategy, of placing his army in a state of constant retreat. Contemporary accounts describe Tecumseh standing before British officers, scanning their faces with fierce disappointment, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You have promised to protect us, and now you are leaving us alone."
Meanwhile, Harrison prepared as if the entire fate of the war rested on the next engagement. His officers noted how he rarely slept, riding along the columns at night, checking on the wounded, ensuring the scouts knew their routes, studying enemy movement through every report. He carried himself with the alertness of a hunter who senses the prey is near, but also with the caution of a man who knows the prey may be just as capable of striking back. By the time the British reached the banks of the Thames River in early October, exhaustion and dwindling resources had ground their forces into desperation. Proctor chose a site he hoped might buy time, placing his troops along a narrow stretch of forest and marsh. Tecumseh positioned his warriors nearby, but refused to retreat further. He knew this ground might be the final stand, not just for the British detachment, but for the dream of a unified native confederacy. When Harrison arrived with his troops, he surveyed the British lines and recognized an opportunity. Their formation revealed desperation, not strength. The American forces pressed forward with tactical clarity, their cavalry cutting swiftly across the battlefield. The clash that followed would be remembered as the Battle of Thames. But before the first shots echoed through the autumn air, before cavalry hooves thundered through the clearing, before the world tilted into chaos, Harrison paused on his horse. He understood that he was not only marching toward a military engagement, he was marching toward a final reckoning with Tecumseh, the opponent who had shadowed his steps for years, the leader whose courage had shaped the very conflict Harrison now sought to end. The road to the Thames was not merely a path toward victory, it was a road toward inevitable fate. And on that road, two men so different in origin, yet so similar in resolve, were destined to meet on the edge of history's turning point. Chapter 7. The Death of a Warrior and the Weight of Victory. In the early morning haze of October 5, 1813, the banks of the Thames River lay unnervingly still. Mist curled around the trees like pale fingers, the kind of silence that presses on the lungs. William Henry Harrison sensed what soldiers learn through instinct rather than training. This was the kind of quiet that arrives only when fate waits nearby. The American army moved into final formation. Horses snorted clouds of steam into the cold air. Rifles clicked softly as men checked their flints. Harrison rode along the line, acknowledging his troops with a firm nod or a brief clap on the shoulder. They knew the campaign had led them to something decisive. They also knew that the man they would face today, Tecumseh, was no ordinary enemy. Across the field, the British line sagged with exhaustion. General Proctor, gaunt and shaken, wore the look of a man who had run out of reasons for retreat, but still could not summon the courage to stand tall in battle. Behind him, officers whispered among themselves, frustrated but helpless. The British army here was but a shadow of its former strength. Tecumseh's warriors, however, stood with a different fire. He moved among them silently, gripping the handle of his tomahawk with the familiarity of a man ready to face his destiny. His presence seemed to lift the fog itself. He did not give grand speeches now. Words were no longer the currency of persuasion.
This battlefield would be the final testament of his resolve. His last dream, the unified native confederacy he had fought for so fiercely, hung like suspended smoke in the morning air. Harrison took his place at the front of the American line. The order was given. The cavalry thundered forward. The Battle of the Thames began in a burst of energy that shattered the morning stillness. The British line collapsed almost immediately. Many fired a single volley before abandoning their posts. Proctor fled on horseback, fleeing so quickly that even his own officers struggled to keep pace. Harrison barely registered the British collapse. His eyes were fixed on the forest to the right, where Tecumseh and his warriors held their ground. There, the real battle began. The Shawnee leader's voice rose above the gunfire, rallying his fighters with a calm intensity that defied the chaos. His warriors held the line fiercely, firing from behind trees, charging when needed, moving with fluid precision taught by generations of forest warfare. Harrison's men advanced steadily. Thick smoke drifted between the trees. The crack of rifles echoed like splintering wood. War cries mingled with the yells of American officers shouting commands. Somewhere in that tangle of smoke and gunshots, at the heart of the fiercest fighting, Tecumseh stood for the final time. Witness accounts differ on the exact moment of his death. Some swore he charged forward fearlessly, meeting the bayonets with the defiance of a warrior facing his fate. Others believed he fell back while protecting younger fighters, refusing to let them break under the pressure of the American cavalry. A few claimed they saw him in a final one-on-one struggle. The truth, lost in the noise of battle, became instead a legend, half memory, half myth. What was certain is this: when the fighting slowed and the smoke thinned, Tecumseh was gone. The Confederacy he envisioned did not die with him immediately, but its heart had been severed. His warriors fought on for a moment longer, then broke, retreating into the forest with heavy spirits. They had not lost to Harrison alone. They had lost to forces far larger: hunger, numbers, the tides of expansion, and the slow erosion of their world.
When Harrison surveyed the aftermath, he felt a complex mix of relief, victory, and a solemn weight he did not speak aloud. Tecumseh had been a formidable adversary, a man of passion and brilliance. Even in death, he commanded respect. Some American soldiers claimed to have found Tecumseh's body. Others argued. Rumors spread instantly, and Harrison refused to involve himself in the spectacle. Whether out of respect or simple political shrewdness, he kept distance from the grisly debate. Instead, he focused on what victory meant. The British retreat from the Northwest was complete. American control over the region was secured. Detroit, once a painful symbol of defeat, now stood firmly under the U.S. flag. Harrison sent reports to Washington detailing the triumph, though many noted that his tone held discipline rather than celebration. Victory on the frontier was rarely clean. It came at the cost of lives, villages, and futures, American, British, and Native alike. In the weeks that followed, Harrison's fame grew rapidly. Newspapers portrayed him as the hero who had avenged earlier defeats and restored American pride. Political allies seized on this image. They understood that a man who could unite frightened settlers, defeat the British, and confront the legendary Tecumseh was someone worth watching. Yet Harrison himself remained quiet in the aftermath. He walked alone some evenings along the riverbank, where a few broken weapons still lay half buried in the mud. Those who saw him noticed he seemed contemplative, not triumphant. War had given him glory, but it had also given him ghosts. Tecumseh's resistance had shaped Harrison's own rise in ways he rarely admitted, even to himself. The Shawnee leader had forced him to become sharper, more strategic,
more aware of how fragile peace could be in the West. Their conflict had carved the rough edges of the American frontier into the fabric of national identity. Now, with his greatest adversary gone, Harrison stood on the cusp of a new era, a shifting political landscape where military heroes became statesmen, where reputation could lift a man to the highest seat in the nation. But he also knew this: the frontier had changed forever, and the echoes of the Thames would follow him for the rest of his life, like a drumbeat growing fainter with distance, but never disappearing. The war had ended a chapter. Harrison's destiny was just beginning to open its next page.
Chapter 8: The Final Days in the Embrace of a Snowstorm. William Henry Harrison had spent his life roaming battlefields, fearing neither spears nor gunfire, unbothered by jungle storms or mountain winds. Ironically, what finally brought him down was an early spring chill in Washington. Not a bullet, not a blade, just the damp, slicing wind that slipped through a thin coat on Inauguration Day. After delivering an inaugural address as long as an epic, nearly 2 hours standing in the cold, Harrison still held the proud bearing of a man who had lived his life in the open wild. Those around him urged him to rest. He brushed them off with a grin. "I have slept through snowstorms in the West. Washington winds are nothing." But a body nearing 70 no longer answers with the strength it once had. A few days later, the coughing began. Doctors of the time knew nothing of bacteria or viruses. They relied on 19th century remedies, bloodletting, opium mixtures, and herbal brews. None of it helped. Pneumonia crept into him quietly, gripping him with the cold, invisible hands of an enemy he could not fight. In his final days, Harrison was more lucid than people assumed. He called his secretary, William Tyler, and spoke in short, broken sentences, half advice to the nation, half the unsettled worries of an old soldier who had not yet finished his mission. He spoke of the burden one must bear, of the will of a man who serves his country until his final breath. Those fragments would later be recorded as his only official last words. On April 4, 1841, just 1 month after taking office, Harrison exhaled his last. He became the president with the shortest term in American history. His death rang like a warning bell, forcing the young and ambitious nation to confront an uncomfortable question: was it truly prepared for sudden shocks? People across the country were stunned. Those who had cheered him during the log cabin and hard cider campaign now fell silent. The tale of the old frontier soldier who wanted to bring wilderness spirit into the White House ended so abruptly that the nation felt unmoored. Though his time was brief, Harrison left behind a strangely important legacy. He forced the United States to define what happens when a president dies in office. From this legal void, history would shape a new precedent, and the man who would step into that void is the figure awaiting us in the next chapter. And so the world of the 10th president begins to open, carrying with it the many turning points of America in the mid-19th century. Chapter 9: The Birth of a Precedent, when John Tyler stepped into history. Harrison's sudden death left Washington stunned, as if the capital had awakened from a nightmare. It wasn't only grief, it was confusion. The U.S. Constitution had never clearly stated what should happen when a president died in office. Would the vice president simply exercise the powers of the presidency, or would he become the actual president? One vague phrase, just ambiguous enough to ignite fierce debates among the nation's most powerful figures. John Tyler, the somewhat distant partner in the Whig coalition, received the grim news at his home in Virginia. Awakened in the middle of the night, he mounted a horse, then transferred to the fastest available steamboat to reach Washington as quickly as possible.
His expression darkened as the final confirmation arrived. Harrison was gone. The nation needed a steady hand. When Tyler entered the White House, the Whig cabinet greeted him with suspicion. They wanted him to serve only as an acting president, a placeholder who would follow their direction. But Tyler, a man with a firm sense of self and a sharp legal mind, rejected that idea outright. I am not the acting president. I am the President of the United States. That single sentence ended the debate. From that moment forward, America had a new precedent. The vice president would become the full president when the incumbent died. The rule proved so essential that it was later written explicitly into the 25th Amendment more than a century later. Yet the precedent was only part of what Tyler inherited. He now led an administration filled with unfinished business, policies Harrison never had the chance to enact, a nation that needed continuity, and a Whig party that viewed him as an outsider accidentally thrust into power. On his first morning as president, Tyler entered Harrison's office. Early sunlight poured across the presidential chair, still cold to the touch. On the desk lay drafts of plans Harrison never signed. Tyler stood silently for several minutes. In that moment, the new 10th president understood that he had inherited more than authority. He had inherited the shadow of a frontier hero taken far too soon. A new chapter of Tyler's life opened that day. One filled with storms, conflict, political isolation, and bold decisions that would shape the United States for decades to come. Ahead lay the battles inside the White House, where Tyler chose a path far different from what the Whig Party expected. Chapter 10. The Legacy of Harrison. Brief but never faded. The life of William Henry Harrison in the presidency ended after only 31 days, so brief that early historical accounts treated him almost like a sad footnote in the list of American presidents. Yet, when the political storms eventually quieted, historians began to notice something intriguing. Despite his extraordinarily short term, his influence reached far beyond what anyone had imagined. Harrison entered the White House as a frontier soldier, strong, plain-spoken, and close to the people. During the campaign, he became the symbol of a changing America, an America of laborers, farmers, immigrants, and those who believed that the nation's strength came from hard work, not aristocratic lineage. His victory proved that the era of noble pedigrees dominating politics was fading away. The public wanted a leader who knew the scent of soil, wind, and gunpowder on the frontier. His long-winded inaugural address, though indirectly contributing to his death, later became a bitter reminder of human fragility. Yet, even in death, Harrison created something unprecedented: a full transfer of executive power to the vice president. That sudden departure paved the way for a solid constitutional precedent that the United States still follows today. Beyond politics, Harrison left behind an unusual family legacy. His son became the father of the 23rd president, Benjamin Harrison, making them the only grandfather-grandson pair in American history to hold the presidency across two different centuries. The Harrison lineage continued to contribute to the nation's military, legal, and cultural life for generations. In a certain sense, the brevity of his presidency made Harrison a figure quiet but resonant. He was like a meteor, appearing swiftly, disappearing just as quickly, yet leaving behind a streak of light that compels future generations to look back and wonder, if Harrison had survived, how might America's path have changed? That question will never have an answer. And it is precisely that open-ended mystery that makes Harrison's life endlessly fascinating to those who love history. a half-open door inviting imagination to step through and explore the unwritten roads beyond.
If you liked this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can keep bringing you more great stories.